Bandwidth for Changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com, and we're hosted on Linode servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. This episode of the Changelog is brought to you by our friends at Sentry. They show you everything you need to know to find and fix errors in your applications. Don't rely on your customers to report your errors. That's not the way you do it. Use Sentry. You can start tracking your errors today for free. They support React, Angular, Ember, Vue, Backbone, Node frameworks like Express and Koa, and many, many other languages. That's just JavaScript I mentioned. View actual code and stack traces, including support for source maps. You can even prompt your users for feedback when front-end errors happen, so you can compare their experience to the actual data. Head to changelog.com/Sentry. Start tracking your errors today for free. No credit cards required. Get off the ground with their free plan. And when you're ready to expand your usage, simply pay as you go. Once again, changelog.com/Sentry. Tell them Adam from the Changelog sent you. And now on to the show. Hello and welcome to the Changelog. This show is about getting to the heart of open source technologies and the people who create them. And on today's show, we're talking about GitHub's recent open source survey with Frannie Zlotnick, Nadia Eghbal, and Mikeal Rogers. You may know Nadia and Mikeal from our other podcast called Request for Commits, changelog.com/RFC. We cover the backstory and key insights of this open data project from GitHub, which sheds light on the broader open source community's attitudes, experiences, and backgrounds of those who use, build, and maintain open source software. So we have a fun show today, a different show than maybe our normal episode of the Changelog. Jared's sitting out. He's got an awesome baseball game to attend with his kids. And we have this cool show called Request for Commits. Nadia Eghbal and Mikeal Rogers host that show. And today we have a show kind of peeling back the layers of this open source survey. And Mikeal, you're here, so might as well say hello.
Hello. It's nice to be on the Changelog.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's been a while. And yeah. On an episode, or I guess the after show of Request for Commits, we were sort of chatting. This was like early this week, I think. And Nadia, you and Frannie have done this cool thing, and many other people too. We'll talk about that. But this open source survey conducted by GitHub. So Nadia, you can say hello as well since you're here.
Hi.
And we also have Frannie here, which Frannie, you're in data at GitHub. What do you work on there?
I am a data scientist. I work on sort of mid to long-term research projects for internal and, in this case, sometimes external audiences. And
what is it about data that gets you excited?
I really love being the first person in the world to see a thing. So I like to know something before anybody else does.
Interesting. And carrying somewhat of a tradition of this show, we like to kind of dig a little bit into somebody's backstory. So what's your story? You're in data, but you work at GitHub. What's some of your backstory that we can share with the audience to kind of give some context to who you are?
Well, my background is academic social science. I was trained as a political scientist, and I got interested in computational social science, which basically means doing social science with data sets that are too big to kind of handle with the normal tools. And so I started doing a little bit of CS and data mining type methodologies. And that kind of led accidentally to working at GitHub. I actually interviewed before I knew what a GitHub was. I sort of fell into it accidentally, but it appealed to me because really the fascinating data on GitHub is all really social data. It's about how people are working together to build things. And so that it's actually like a really fantastic place to be doing data work from a social science perspective.
I have an interesting history with GitHub to some degree because I remember sitting in San Francisco in a random office with Chris Wanstroth and Tom Preston Warner conducting an interview for a podcast called The Web 2.0 Show. And this was like literally a month and a half after GitHub launched. So it's been a trek, so GitHub has evolved over the years. Like it started out as social coding and has done all these cool things to like raise, I guess, the bar of open source, but also make it so much more accessible to the world. So GitHub has evolved tremendously. At first launch, it didn't need, maybe it did need data scientists. I don't know, but you can totally see a true need now. And then obviously the survey, opensourcesurvey.org, and I guess that redirects to 2017 because you have plans for future versions of this. Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So like we're in a new world where GitHub is essentially many might say the epicenter of open source, and now needing folks like Frannie to help make sense and see data first and hopefully put back the layers of what's important out there.
One of the things that I find really interesting about this data set too is that, GitHub changed open source, and now those people that are flooding in are sort of changing GitHub a little bit too. And it's really interesting to see some insights into what they think. How did the survey start? Like there's a lot of academic surveys out there. So I'm curious what the motivation behind this particular one was.
This particular survey was kind of the idea of a guy who used to work on the open source team at GitHub named Arvin Smith, who was our open data person, program manager for open data. And I think he's been on, I think you guys have interviewed him before. Yeah.
Yep. He was in season 1.
Yeah. So he came to me, several months ago, 8-9 months ago, I think, maybe more, and had this idea to use the access that we had to the open source community to gather high quality data for researchers, and in particular academic researchers studying open source development and processes, help them get better data than they're able to get otherwise. Because you're right, there are a ton of surveys out there because this is a fascinating domain. Like it's a weird and unique form of production of public goods that a lot of the world's critical services are based on. And people are really interested in understanding how and why people participate or don't in this community. But it's hard to get good data on it.
Why is that? Like what makes it hard to get good data? Is it selecting the right kind of people or them self-selecting or? Yeah,
for the types of questions that people are interested in, a large part of the problem is getting access to the right people. So this is a community that's kind of over-surveyed. People get a lot of emails asking them to take surveys, and at some point they get tired of doing it. And so it's hard to get the people you want to talk to take a survey. So sampling is hard. Unbiased way is really difficult to do. So generally what people have done is they'll go through, public records of open source projects and look for people who have committed or otherwise participated in the project and then just email them. But that means you miss this huge community of people that we know are there who are using projects and looking at them, but not necessarily actively contributing to them. And we think that that's a really important part of the community as well. But unless they leave a visible artifact of having been there, there's no way for the researchers to know that they're there. So by having access to the traffic going to these projects, we have an ability to get to people in a way that is virtually impossible for most other people.
Yeah. It certainly makes sense to be GitHub and conduct this interview because otherwise on the outside, it may, like you had just said, it's difficult to sort of seamlessly access those kind of people. Let's rewind a bit and kind of touch base on exactly what this is. So this is an open source survey conducted by GitHub in collaboration with researchers from academia, industry, other folks from the community. The purpose was to gather high quality insights and data from those who are interacting with or even just checking out open source projects. A lot of responses, a little over 5,000 responses, not only from GitHub's data pool, but also it seems like random samples from other communities that aren't the GitHub platform, and then open sourcing that data set. Is that right?
So it's a little over 5,500 randomly sampled respondents from open source repos on GitHub, and then another 500-ish responses from a non-random sample of communities off GitHub. So we know that not all open source is on GitHub. There's a bunch of very important projects that predate GitHub or work on other platforms for lots of reasons. And we wanted them to be part of the sample as well. It's harder for us to access them for obvious reasons. So that sample is non-random. But we did try to make an effort to make sure that they're represented in the data as well.
Right. And when you say like random and non-random, that's really important to say for what reason. As somebody who doesn't do data much, why is it so important to make that distinction?
Yeah, so typically the way these sorts of the open source surveys have been done is to use opt-in sampling. Basically, somebody makes a survey and then they publicize it in lots of places like Twitter or on a website. And they basically kind of broadcast that they're doing a survey and ask people to come to them. And that means that people go out of their way to say, I want you to hear my opinion. And the people who do that are kind of weird, right? They're people who have really strong opinions on things, or they're people who think taking a survey is a fun way to spend 15 minutes, which is weird. Right? Like there's lots of reasons why that's not, that gets you a pretty biased sample. It gets you a like very opinionated sample. It's subject to basically like kind of gaming. Like people will try to send the link to specific groups that they want to take the survey, but maybe not other people. And so the way you get high quality data that is closer to representative of the whole community is you randomly select people, hopefully in a way that gives everybody who's there an equal probability of being invited to take the survey.
With that in mind, you've got quite a few questions. So maybe not a 15-minute survey, maybe half hour, 45 minutes. This is 50 questions. What's the rough average that you would expect for someone to dedicate towards answering this?
This is actually, it was like an 11 to a 15-minute survey, depending on which set of branches you hit. So if you answered some questions in a certain way, you'd get some additional questions. But the average time was something like 11 minutes. And that was intentional. Like a really long survey is really tedious and taxing, and we wanted to, you get better data if people don't find it really annoying to take your survey. So we made a big effort to make sure that we use almost exclusively closed response questions, that we wrote them in a really straightforward way, that it was easy to take the survey as fast as possible, given the volume of stuff we wanted to cover. So that it wouldn't take up too much of people's time. And we had actually a really good completion rate. It was something like 50% of the people who started taking it finished it, which is really high for a survey of this length.
That is really high, because I've visited lots of surveys and been like, no.
I was nervous about that. I was like afraid people weren't going to take it because it was a really long survey, but yeah, it turned out to be great.
Well, surveys in general are pretty tough. Mike, you may have some experience with Node Foundations. I know you do surveys there, or have done surveys there each year. Were you involved in that at all?
Yeah. I mean, we did the one where you kind of blast everybody and you try to get everybody to get in on the survey. The one thing that we do to try to quantify what kinds of respondents we're getting is that we ask a question: how many years have you been using Node? And we have a pretty good idea of what the growth trajectory is. So we know, how many users in the overall community have only been using it a year, 2 years, 3 years. And so we know that the respondents tend to be people who are in this slice of our community that is very high. And so we don't consider the results to be, representative of the entire community, more like representative of the people that have more experience, because those are the people that end up filling out the survey. And we have a few other questions in there that help us kind of slice up the data to know which section of the community that it's addressing. We don't really have any kind of mechanism to randomly select the way that GitHub can here. So they can really look at it and get like a very truly representative sample.
Yeah. And to be fair, there's also another, we have this problem of response bias too, where not everyone we invite actually takes it. So like some certain percentage of the people that we invited to take it actually did so. And so there's certainly ways in which the people who did decide to take it are different from the overall community. For example, a huge percentage of people say that they are maintainers or people who have actually contributed. That and we know that we see in our traffic numbers that there are many, many more people who are just visiting or using repos without actually necessarily actively contributing to them, and they are not represented in the data in as high numbers as we see. So there's still this sort of bias in who decides to participate, but because we invited in a random way, it's a better sample, not necessarily precisely representative, but it is higher quality than you would otherwise get.
Let's find out where this came from, if you don't mind. I want to go deeper into the context, some of the insights discovered from this, but it sounds like this has been in the making for quite a while. You mentioned Arvon Smith, also on season 1 of RFC. Great episode. We'll put that in the show notes, so go check that out. But this predates your getting hired there, Nadia. So, like, where does this begin in terms of like motivation? What was the purpose? What were the beginnings of this effort?
Yeah, the motivation was really just to make data available for people to do interesting and good research on this community. It's good for us internally at GitHub if people are doing research on what makes open source sustainable and healthy. The data is useful to us as well. And we also have interest in making sure that the data is available not just to researchers, but also broadly available to the people who can kind of do the most with it, which is the community itself. So the idea was really just to use our kind of unique position with regard to the community to be able to create high quality data that could then be used by other people to do interesting research and to help people make decisions on like what their communities need, and help people kind of understand the different parts of their communities, like help maintainers understand contributors, help, contributors understand users who don't necessarily contribute, things like that.
Can you go back to the moment to some degree? Like, was it some sort of message, an email? Was it a face-to-face conversation? Like, what was the original context for like, hey, we should do this survey. We need to know this information, and kind of who was there and what was going on to sort of surface this desire?
I think it was a video chat between me and Arvin. He sent me a message. He sent me a message, asked me to meet, and I think at this time Arvin was doing his like nomadic thing. He was traveling around the country in a van with his family.
Right. Yes.
And so I don't remember exactly where he was, but I was in our office, and he was in a van somewhere.
Last time we caught up with him for RFC, he was in Canada. So that was about 9 months ago. So it might have been then.
It might have been then. I think I remember there being some trees behind him. It looked really pretty.
Canada's got a lot of trees.
And he just pitched this idea to me. He said, I would love to, if we could do a survey of open source, do it well, with rigorous academic standards, because there's a ton of data out there. People really want to know these things, but they don't have either the tools or the maybe the technical background to know how to do it in a high quality way. And it's impactful. People are using the data to make decisions about what they do, or they're publishing papers on it. Can we do something that would provide good data, help get people interested in using our data for other types of things, and also make sure that when people are trying their best to make data-driven decisions, that they're using high-quality data. And I thought that sounded really interesting. I've mostly been working on internal-facing things, reports for internal people at the company, and it sounded like a really fun opportunity to learn more about open source, because I'm not a domain expert in it, and to do something that would have a really wide audience and potentially a really large impact.
After the break, we'll dive deep into the insights of this open source survey from GitHub. With more than 50 questions, this survey is by far one of the most widest range research topics GitHub has done to release as open data. So we're going to highlight some of the most actionable, important insights from this after this break. This episode of the Changelog is brought to you by TopTal, a global network of top freelance software developers, designers, and finance experts. If you're looking for contract or freelance opportunities, apply to join TopTal to work with top clients like Airbnb, Artsy, Zendesk, and more. When you join TopTal, you'll be part of a global community of developers who have the freedom and flexibility to live where they want, travel, attend TopTal events all over the world, and more. And on the flip side, if you're looking to hire developers, designers, or finance experts, TopTal makes it super easy to find qualified talent to join your team. Head to toptal.com, that's TOPTAL.com, and tell them Adam from the Changelog sent you.
I'm kind of ready to dive into the insights a little bit. Is everybody else ready to dive into the insights?
Do it, man. Open it up, Mikeal.
So this first one about documentation is actually very interesting to me. It seems like something obvious, right? Like, of course, docs are important, but everybody says that, and nobody actually does a very good job of it. And it's interesting here because the way that it's framed, you have a question about problems that are encountered in open source. And some of the other things you ask about other than documentation are, unresponsiveness or dismissive responses in issues and PRs and things like that. And I know that across all the projects that are trying to take getting new contributors seriously, there's been a huge focus on improving that flow and making things nicer and easier to get in, and maybe not so much on documentation. And now we're seeing this data that really shows that documentation is much, much higher. Like it's something like, what is it, 96% of respondents?
93%.
93%. Wow. That's unbelievable. Yeah. So it looks like, more than just this question, y'all really dove into this to figure out, what is going on here. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
So one of the things that is pretty well studied are the reasons why people do contribute to or otherwise engage with open source. But a thing that hasn't been as well studied are the things that prevent people who would like to, but are not necessarily contributing as much or in the ways that they want to. And so we devoted kind of a whole section of the survey to negative experiences in open source, which is, probably kind of a bummer to take the survey and only get to talk about the crappy things you encounter. But it was where there's kind of a hole in the data that existed as I saw it. And also kind of more actionable than, tell us all the wonderful things you get out of doing open source. Those are kind of self-evident. We know a lot about that already. What we don't know are more about the types of things that get in people's way that make it hard for them to contribute.
I like the tie of tying it to our findings around different groups that aren't traditionally super well represented in open source value those processes more. And I thought that was an important way to tie together why documentation matters to also getting new contributors.
Yeah, you made a particular point in here about English and how, what was it? Nearly a quarter of open source communities have less than very well English skills. So it's not just about it's not saying all docs need to be in another language, but that it needs to be in a form of English that is not really complicated, right? That's
something actually that I personally discovered while at Node Interactive recently, Mikeal, when I was invited to come out there with y'all and do that. And I was talking to Xia Liu, and she was originally from China, but works at Autodesk and had moved to San Francisco, but also kind of went back and forth, talked about the Great Firewall China, the disconnection there, but she talked a really big deal about the difference of accessibility to docs because of the language barrier, but then the time it takes for things to be translated, and by the time it is translated, or if it ever is, it's kind of too late.
Yeah. The way that we've kind of solved this in the Node project is just that a lot of people that speak other languages are contributors or committers in some way, and they watch doc changes. And so as doc changes happen, they make suggestions about the language to simplify it a little bit, to make it more easily translatable, but also that just makes it more understandable.
I've noticed a lot of translations get out of date. I mean, probably not as much for Node, but for smaller projects where like a relatively common contribution or is someone volunteering to translate the docs, but then that's not a commitment to keeping them updated forever. So yeah, I definitely see the value of, if you're going to write in English, at least simplifying the language can make a big difference.
So I saw a completely different piece of research lately. It tried to quantify all of the steps that a contributor to open source goes through, not just the visible ones like the pull request and each comment and things like that, but a lot of the sort of invisible steps that they do on their own, like running the test locally and checking documentation. And I was kind of blown away by the number of times that they check some form of documentation in the project, right? Like they try to find things that are similar. They try to like check the documentation or the code style and all these things. And so and that should have made me not very surprised when I saw that documentation was so important, but still I don't think that I internalized it enough. But like a huge part of the process of contributing is just going back to the documentation and reading it.
Well, no one's too good for docs, right? I mean, you're never expert enough to not need docs is my point, right? Is that no matter how good you are, it's like, what was the document and how was that used? You're never, you can't, if you can't keep it on your brain, you're superhuman. And I don't know how you got there, but write a book about it or something.
It's like it's kind of dumb not to, like, why remember all this stuff when you can just refer to documentation when you need it? I don't want to waste that brain space.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, when we look at this, it sounds like you had 50 good questions, but from that, at least at the public website, we got 5 kind of core highlighted actionable insights. One of them being documentation. Frannie, you mentioned the negative interaction section. So there's some insights around that, how open source is being used by the whole entire world, not just, let's say San Francisco, for example. Using and contributing to it, to open source happens a lot, even on the job, and that it's often the default when choosing open source software. Why, at least from the public website, only share those insights? What's the plan for future insights being shared?
That's a good question. So I think we wanted to highlight some of the more actionable things so things that we knew would be either like really highly interesting that people would really want to know about. So like the demographic stuff falls in that category. Some stuff that's really actionable, like write documentation, make sure that it's accessible to people with varying English skills. And then stuff that was kind of really strong signals in the data. It's certainly not all that there is in there. And I think like a fully complete treatment of all the data in there would be just overwhelming. And people would stop reading it. They wouldn't go through the whole thing. So we wanted to keep it like pretty limited to some key things, and then leave the rest of it open for other people to find and to research and publish on. Because the original idea was really, the point was the data, that we would be putting out the data for the research community and for the open source community to do what they will with. And the kind of insight section was more of we found all this fascinating stuff. We want to make sure that people actually do learn these things from there. But it's kind of a small chunk of what's in there.
I'll also add, for any of those like top 5 or whatever insights, it wasn't like one question to one insight. Each of those was a mix of probably like at least 5 questions per section of looking at the data and saying, like the documentation part is interesting, but then the like non-native English speakers is interesting. What does that mean together? And so some of that was already a little bit of an analysis and mixing together existing questions. We did go through all of the questions as a group, just to see, given like Frannie's experience with data and my experience with like open source, and we had a few other folks in there too, of just saying like, given our collective knowledge, what do we think is really interesting and actionable here? But yeah, it's definitely not complete either.
I think it's a little timely too. Like as we've been recording season 2 of RFC, we've been able to talk to a lot more people that have raised money for their projects, for fairly big kind of notable projects. And a recurring theme seems to be, we have this money and we don't know what to do with it because there's not a lot of like really discrete specific things that you can spend it on. But documentation is one of those things. Like you can hire somebody to just write better documentation.
Yeah.
That's like a really actionable thing. And, you know, armed with this data to say like, actually, this is the most important thing. This is probably something that we should spend money on. Like that's really actionable and really timely.
That makes a lot of sense because we often hear we're not really, we have money. How do we spend it? And do we spend it on staffing more people to, you know, put more developers behind a project? Or do we embrace or, you know, invite community into this? Do we do events? Do we do meetups? Do we do swag? It's like there's so many unknowns out there, and so being able to like have, you know, unbiased opinions on what really matters certainly gives better waypoints for maintainers and community leaders in open source to take action upon. You know, without something like this, you're sort of just shooting in the dark.
It was fun to see a lot of common wisdom that gets passed around and seeing how that maps to the data that we found. And some of them were really spot on. I was actually thinking of you, Mikeal, in the like negative interactions findings, because you had this tweet from a while ago that was like, don't tolerate asshole. Oh, sorry, Adam.
No, it's okay. Go ahead. Hey, heads up, if you're in a car with a kid, you got your kids around, mute it or whatever. Go ahead.
Just repeating his tweet verbatim. It's something like don't tolerate assholes in open source because new people that see that will want to walk away or something like that. You probably remember it better than I do, but
yeah, well, there's an interesting Venn diagram that goes with it, which is basically like, you know, like assholes are this really small dot, and then there's, you know, people who tolerate assholes, and then, you know, and then a much larger bubble of nice people, and some nice people will tolerate that kind of behavior, but far more just won't. And so you're excluding this much bigger group when you sort of like accommodate people who are toxic, right?
And that was totally what we had found about smaller portion of people have personally experienced something, but a lot more people have seen something happen. And there's a pretty like significant number of people that stop contributing to a project when they see behavior like that. And so I thought it was good to actually have data to say this really does matter, and that common practice or common wisdom is actually true and useful.
It's interesting to see how much negativity is out there, though. I mean, even 18% of respondents having that's enough. I mean,
it's a lot. Yeah,
it's a huge amount. That means like if you interact with open source 100 times, 18 times out of those 100, you're going to get, you know, some sort of negative reaction. I got negativity today. I mean, it happens.
Hold on. You're interpreting the data a little bit off there. So this is of individual people, not individual interactions.
Well, that's 18% of response. Oh, I guess you're right. Okay. So it's not, okay. You're right. I'll stand corrected then. But I'm sure my number is just as accurate.
It still sucks.
So, I mean, it's definitely, it's not great. It's definitely higher than you would want it to be, but it's also not out of line with data from similar communities, especially online communities. Like it's not necessarily just open source that has this problem, but I think the visibility of open source, like everything being open and kind of having a little bit of a viral aspect to it, like people send really like kind of fiery issues to each other just to, you know, take a look at what happened over here. That's the visibility might be higher, but this kind of like people being jerks to each other on the internet is a thing that happens in a lot of places.
I think one of the insights here is like you have 50% of people have witnessed negative behavior, and 21% of them have actually left a project because of that. Just from the witnessing, not even necessarily the being, you know, the victim of it.
Well, that's the truth. It's like if you just witness the negative behavior, you're going to assume that that's a common thing or a standard, or it happens often, especially if you see negativity unresponded to, you know, like allowing it, you know, that's a difference. It's like, that's why I think maybe your tweet, Mikeal, and Nadia, your mention of it may be right on point, because if you allow somebody to be that jerk, then, you know, you're not so much just as at fault, but somebody needs to say, you know, hey, that's not how we act here. And I think that's probably a good reason why a lot of code of conducts have become more more common is to say, if you're going to participate in this, whatever this is, here are the rules for which we all agree to abide by. And if you don't, here's the ramifications, and here's how you contact someone to say, hey, this is happening. Can you please make it stop?
I want to reemphasize Frannie's point about that the levels of negative interactions that we saw is not that different from other online communities. Because one thing that was sort of sad to see in a lot of the press findings was, or a lot of the press reporting was, their takeaway was this open source is really terrible and toxic, and everything is just like, Linus Torvalds. And it makes me sad because I think, at least for me, part of the goal with this data was to, I don't want to scare people off from contributing to open source. And I think it's important to highlight that this stuff's like, it's not great, but it's not different from other online communities. And I think open source gets an unfair reputation for that, and it turns a lot of people off from it. But like, none of it is great because humans are just kind of not nice to each other on the internet, period, when left unchecked. But being able to see that is useful.
I think one important difference, though, between GitHub and other online communities is that if you're like really into ham radios and you go on the ham radio forum and you experience negative behavior, your choice is basically, I stop talking about ham radios on the internet, or I continue to put up with this. And on GitHub, it's literally like, I just go to another project that's not terrible.
Yeah.
And so you have this huge number of people that like actually just leave projects because of it, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, too, you can't make or instill a change unless you measure it, right? That's a known thing. So just having this data alone shouldn't say, oh, this is this is an issue, or this is to scare people off, as you said. It should be, something that attracts some change. Being aware of an issue is the way you instill some change.
Exactly.
Coming up after the break, we get into a heavy topic, dealing with negativity in open source. We also talked about maintainers having to be the police. And an even more touchy subject, the accuracy of this research. Is this a true representation of the overall open source community? All this and more after the break. This episode of the Changelog is brought to you by GoCD, an open source continuous delivery server from our friends at ThoughtWorks. GoCD lets you model complex workflows, promote trusted artifacts, see how your workflow really works, deploy any version, anytime, run and grok your tests, compare builds, take advantage of plugins, and so much more. Check out gocd.io/changelog to learn more. And now back to the show. This is a tough subject, not often discussed. The impact of negativity in open source. And sometimes when that happens, people are forced to go into private channels or to enforce their code of conduct and get into very uncomfortable situations. Basically having to deal with these negative experiences that have real consequences to not just the people, but also to the project. And sometimes people just don't interact, or they just don't interact publicly. What do you think?
Yeah, people can, they might withdraw from a project. They might keep working on the project, but start working in kind of back channels. Instead of working publicly in the repo, they might start pinging people through email or Slack or other methods to avoid sort of like the public microscope of attention on the work, or maybe like risk of like somebody saying something really critical and that ending up being sort of part of their public professional record.
Well, no one wants that, right? I mean, if we were in an issue and Michael called me a name, I would probably not want to talk to him ever again, for one, and then two, I would just be like, not being involved in this anymore. I'm done. Or maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I would just take it and just feel stupid. What do you think, Michael? What are common interactions to like? I mean, is that how you would respond?
I mean, what do I think? Is in like you want to test this out and have me call your name on the internet?
Yeah, sounds like you're
Yeah.
No, I think the kind of top line of this is that people that experience negative behavior, it's okay, I would put it this way. It's really important to deal with negative behavior when it happens at the project level. The next point in here is that, the most effective tool here is to ban people, and that maybe even banning people like fairly liberally is a fairly good idea. And one of the arguments that we hear over and over again is that using bans and using other moderation tools, we keep creating a higher and higher bar for like the kinds of behavior that does that. But there are a lot of other negative consequences to not dealing with it. Like, not just the person who's the victim of the behavior, but also everybody watching can just move to another project a lot of the time, or they might, move into private channels, which is like not good for an open source project. And so it's just like really important to deal with the behavior, right? To actually moderate it in some way. Because if you don't, something like 3 times the number of people that experience it are potentially also seeing it, and they're going to do something as a result, right?
The problem with the blocking part, though, to me, at the banning the blocking, is that somebody's got to be the police and somebody's got to be the bad guy, or bad person, so to speak. Like somebody. Which is okay, but that just means that somebody who may not exactly want to take on the role of being the enforcer, so to speak, has to take on that role. And that has to happen in every single project. And that could become an issue just generally. Like, I don't always want to be the bad person and say, hey, you can't play anymore. And because you've crossed the line here. I get it that it's needed, but it's hard to be that person.
We asked about individual users having the ability to block another user. So, and that's separate from asking a maintainer to go in and block somebody from a project. So, actually the finding is that an individual having the ability to block another user without having to involve somebody else is the part that is most effective at addressing problematic behavior. If you have to ask a third party, we asked about we asked about maintainers, we asked about sort of legal intervention, police intervention, ISPs or hosting services. Bringing in these third parties at any level is less effective than giving people the power to protect themselves on an individual basis. And so I think the findings suggest that you want to move away from having a kind of third party policeman and give people tooling to be able to say, like, whether or not this person is part of this community or not, I don't want to interact with them. That seems to be... So
a singular level opt-out, basically.
Yeah. Because, anything that relies on maintainers, first of all, as you said, it puts somebody in this police role that they probably don't want to be in, or that they may or may not want to be in. And it also means that you need to have a really responsive maintainer in order to have any sort of ability to have this. Yeah. And, there's lots of projects where the maintainers are not necessarily responsive on the timeline that you would need in order to address it.
It certainly adds one more notch to the job role of being a maintainer, if that were the case, must also be police,
Well, and I think that it's important for you to think about these things in your project, but that's a really good point, which is that a lot of individual maintainers are just not engaged enough in the project to even do that, and in fact there's not a lot of other people engaged in that particular issue, so it's really enough for the one user that's seeing this to just block that person, or experiencing it to block that person, and that kind of scales down to all of these smaller projects that don't have as much infrastructure. I'll also just give a shout out to GitHub making improvements. That there is a beta tested feature right now for temporary bans at the org level, so you can kick people out temporarily, and it's not so much of a perma ban. And it's a nice way to say that behavior is not appropriate. Here's a consequence, but you're not banned for life.
Yeah, I see this finding as being the people who should pay attention to this finding are people like us, like GitHub, like other platforms. It's like a platform level finding. This is what we need to build in order to make sure that communities have the ability for people to work in healthy and safe ways. It's not necessarily at the project level, it's not necessarily on a maintainer to go build something to do this, right? The platforms should make this available.
Nice. So earlier we talked a bit about how this has been covered in the media. In that vein, I saw an article in Wired talking about some of the gender imbalance stuff, and one thing that I noticed was that the metrics that they took from the survey, they were sort of implying were the overall GitHub metrics, and that the overall GitHub users were only 3% women. And so I'll let you dig into that a little bit. So can you tell us a little bit about the gender imbalance findings that you found?
Yeah, so they're not good. It's 95% of the people who gave a substantive answer to the gender question identified as men, and only 3% identified as women. Another 1% identified as non-binary. It's just like a profound imbalance. There's no other way to talk about it.
Does this go back to the pool for which the data represents? Going back to the random, non-random question, biased, unbiased, and this assumes that the person was on GitHub, right? They were prompted some way to say, we have this survey, please take part. Being that it's such a wide chasm between, those numbers, 95%, 3%, 1%, I'm just wondering, given that big of a difference, how confident do you feel in the accuracy of that? Being, if you took the same and you expanded across all of GitHub and everyone who's ever interacted with GitHub answered, would that still be true?
I don't. So the way we sampled was definitely not how you would try to get all GitHub users. Like, you had to do a really specific set of actions on a licensed open source repo that indicated like sincere interest in open source in order to make it into the pool. And then we randomly sampled from that. So it's definitely in no way representative of the general GitHub user base.
Can you share what those actions might be, maybe to kind of give folks
Yeah.
Or is that secret stuff?
It's not secret. You had to do, if you download the data set, there's some documentation that has more details than the website. You had to do something like 3 clicks on a licensed repo or visit 3 licensed projects within 30 minutes in order to make it into the sampling frame. And that's because it's really easy to fall into a GitHub repo from Google and like not really intend to be there.
Right.
So we were trying to make sure that we're only getting people who like seem to have a sincere interest in open source. To get back to the sampling part, there's a possibility that, maybe women are more likely to use open source or be interested in it, but not be contributors. And maybe they felt like when they got invited, we didn't actually mean them. Like maybe they don't consider themselves a member of the community or something. So they thought like, oh, we probably don't want to hear from them. Like that's possible. Yeah. But like an imbalance this large, I think that this is probably pretty accurate for open source. And it's consistent with, basically all other research that's been done on open source communities that it, like between 1% and 10%.
Yeah, the reason why I asked this question isn't to deny the accuracy. It's because it makes me sad.
It took me a few weeks to like process that finding.
Yeah, I mean that's really sad. To that's, if that is representative of the truth, that's like we've got to do a better job.
Well, understanding how the selection works now, I'm not that surprised because I've seen these other studies that show between 1% and 10%, and all of them have like different issues in their sampling, but like at no point has there ever been data that shows that open source is as good as even the rest of the industry, which is only 22%. And just like from my own experience, when you work in these communities, as you work your way up the kind of engagement stack from user and casual contributor and then eventually into leadership, the numbers just get smaller and smaller and smaller and will become like less and less visible. With a couple, individual communities as really important exceptions that should probably be studied so that we can figure out how to do this better. But yeah, I think, yeah, I'm unhappy about the number, but now I can see why it would be there.
So if someone has my reaction, and this is a question for all of you here, what can we as a community do? What are some ways to fine tune that ratio to be a bit more less of a chasm between the two?
One thing that made me happy from the reaction was there are a couple of people who offered to prominent open source contributors who offered to mentor people that are trying to get into open source. I think from the React community, there were a couple of people. So I thought that was really nice just for people to be sort of like aware that if the numbers are that bad, like it's really important to keep an eye out for people that are interested in contributing, but might need a little bit of an extra push. That's not obviously like super scalable, but I thought it was just like a nice human response. And yeah, I mean, stuff like about for me, the documentation part of it ties really strongly back to this of document your stuff and make it as transparent as possible so everybody understands how to get into it. That was why we did the open source guides earlier this year too, so that it doesn't feel like open source is this big, like shadowy process, and you have to talk to the right people to understand how it works. Some of that ties into also the findings around people who had given or received help from a stranger in open source, and seeing that women were less likely to ask for help from a stranger because there's sort of the assumption that I'm not allowed to do that or whatever.
Yeah.
So just really going out of your way to knowing that, and it's not just women. I mean, like there are a lot of people who are hesitant to contribute because they don't feel comfortable asking for those sort of things. So making processes really explicit and transparent might bring more people out of the woodwork than you would expect. That was my take on it.
Yeah. This last point here too, half of contributors say that their open source work was somewhat or very important in getting their current job or role. I mean, that's in the same area we're talking about here in terms of this data being shown on the website, but like that, knowing how crucial open source is in general, but then also at the micro level of me or someone else getting a future job or the dream job, so to speak, how important it is to be able to interact with open source makes it even more important to be welcoming, because it's that important. Mm-hmm. to them as a person, but also generally to tech in general.
I've also seen data that shows that people with open source experience make more money on average too than other average developers. So it's also important there.
Yep.
I think one of the answers to this problem you can see in this data a little bit, right? Like you have the differences between men and women on some of these things, and some of the biggest gaps are in code of conduct and welcoming community. That this is just far more important to women. And I've certainly experienced this as like a conference organizer where you're trying to invite and get people out. And especially when it's, the first time that people are being visible, women are much more cautious about this than men are.
Is it the code of conduct and what it says, or is it the fact that it's there because somebody knew it was important enough to put there and take the time to figure out what that community's conduct should represent?
I feel like at this point, if you don't have it, you're making a different kind of statement. It's not that the code of conduct makes a statement. It's actually not having it as the statement. And that's a really negative statement.
I don't know if it's let's use the changelog as an example, because like we literally, as of like maybe a week, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, maybe, and today is June 5th, WWDC day, by the way, Apple good stuff, whatever. But we just recently put a code of conduct in, and that's not because we're idiots. It's because we didn't think we really needed one. We're a podcast, primarily a group of podcasts, a newsletter, so we didn't really have a community. And we've actually had a membership / community for a while now. And for me, my paralysis, and I'm not sure if this reflects Jarrett's opinion, but for me, my paralysis around it was like, I don't know the first step to enact one. Do I write it by hand? Do I adopt one from another community that best represents me? Kind of going down a rabbit hole here, but the point I'm trying to make is that like even us, I would imagine like we're pretty close to open source and we realize how important this is. Only recently did we enact one. And, I don't feel like we were behind the curve. I felt like we did it when we needed to,
we wrote an open source guide about that. Just saying.
Maybe I didn't read it yet.
One of the neat things about
no, that's good.
One of the neat things about the code of conduct findings, we didn't highlight this in the write-up, but I kind of wish we had was that it has this reputation of being controversial because there's some loud people on the internet who really, really hate them. But our findings show that they're actually not controversial. So we allowed people to say about all these things in that table that you're looking at, from responsive maintainers all the way down to contributor license agreements. Like, is it very important to have it, all the way to doesn't matter either way, all the way to very important not to have it. So we allowed people to say, like, I really, really don't want to see this on a project, all the way to I really want to see it. And only something like 4% of people said it was important not to have a code of conduct. Like, the vast majority of people either really want to see them, they say it's important, or they're kind of indifferent about it. And that includes men. If you throw all the women in the data out, that's still true. So they're broadly popular. You're not actually going to dissuade a lot of contributors from participating if you have one, even though there's this sort of like reputation on the internet that it's sort of you're taking a side in a culture war. Like, most people actually are like pretty happy to see one, or they don't care either way. So it seems like a good and easy way to make your community welcoming to the people who care about it, and it's not going to turn away other people.
Well, I think either way, it's really about opening the door, right? Like you said, if people are indifferent, then they're not going to stay or leave because of it. But there are going to be people who don't come at all if you don't have it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not just codes of conduct too. I mean, I think there's also just a broader cultural issue of, I can only speak from my experience, so I guess I'll just do that, but of sometimes like wanting to have permission to do something, or feeling like you're not good enough, and unless someone says you're good enough to do a thing, and then you're okay to do it. So it's not like, for me at least, like, it's not like I wouldn't speak at a conference if, like, it's not like if I see a code of conduct, it's like, oh, great, this is the conference for me. But it's more like, well, am I qualified as a speaker? Is that okay? And so for me, like, one of the big takeaways from something like certain groups wanting processes clearly spelled out or documentation is just like really encouraging people when they're on the fence to just say, yes, you can do it, just do it. And just being really supportive and encouraging of people that might be kind of like hovering in the sidelines, unsure whether they want to participate or not. Like, everyone can play that role day to day of, if you see someone with potential, just encourage them to get out there.
Yeah. And I think to call back to what we were talking about earlier with sort of signaling to everybody watching that, you care about this kind of thing, how you handle that pull request and that discussion around a code of conduct says a lot about the project. Because while it isn't controversial among most maintainers, as this data shows, it is controversial among 4chan members who will show up and just start saying stuff. And like, either you allow that to become like a giant thread that derails the pull request, or you merge it and close it and lock it and say, I'm sorry, but that's not our community, go away. And that sends the right kind of signal, right?
That's a good takeaway. The people who are really loud about this stuff are not actually representative of the silent majority.
Coming up after the break, we talk about the relationship of businesses and open source, how they use it, whether or not they encourage contributing to it. We also examine how open source has become the cultural default in many cases, what people actually value in open source, because you might be surprised, and what you can expect from the future of the survey. This episode of the Changelog is brought to you by our friends at Microsoft and Azure Open Dev Conference, their upcoming no-cost live virtual conference that's focused on showcasing open source technologies on Azure. Engineers are looking to bring more of the open source tools they know and love to the cloud, but often need a grounding on what to look out for and what to expect. The fastest way to learn is to see live demonstrations and get time to Q&A with experts in the field. Microsoft is providing this at no cost. It's a virtual event, which means you don't have to travel anywhere. Reserve your spot today. Head to azure.com/opendev. That's azure.com/opendev to register for this free live event from Microsoft. It is on June 21st, 2017. And now back to the show. I can't remember the exact quote you have, Mikeal, but you had a quote on the bonus episode, the season 1, the behind the scenes episode of Request for Commits, about the relationship of businesses and their relationship with open source and how it's severely skewed, with so much as this data shows of open source contributions happening on the job. It kind of reflects back onto that idea that more companies should help sustain open source. And that doesn't mean just money. It might mean the 10% time or the 20% time being allowed towards open source. We've been talking about this on Request for Commits. What do you all think about this finding? Are you surprised? Are you enlightened?
I have a couple of things that are surprising about this. So one is I was really surprised that the number of people that found certain policies unclear. That was really interesting to me. And I'm very curious, like, do they contribute anyway when it's unclear? Do they use it anyway when it's unclear?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they do.
Yeah,
Yes, they do.
there are
Okay.
actually separate questions like, what's your employer's policy and what do you do? And when the people who say that it's either unclear or they don't know what the policy is, their practices look like those of people who say their policies are supportive of it. So in the absence of any like clear rule, people will do it. And I think that like demonstrates like you kind of need to in like modern software development is like open source is pervasive. You can't not use it and you need to fix things if they don't work. So if you have any justifiable way of doing it, you will do it. That's what I took from that.
So, see, I find that really fascinating, right? So they're doing it anyway, but it's not like they're being encouraged to do it. Like, I think that the people that say that they have a permissive, that means that their employer has been very clear that they can and that they should, right?
It was people, permissive means either your employer is encouraging of it, which was like about a little less than half, like 46%, or they were accepting of it. Like they wouldn't tell you not to do it, but they wouldn't necessarily like go out of their way to encourage it.
So what is the disparity between people encouraging the use of open source versus the contribution to open source?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
So using open source applications and using open source dependencies are incredibly high, right? So you have the permissive, which I think covers encourages and allows, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really high, right? It's in like 80%. But it drops considerably when you talk about contributing. So clearly there's like a huge disparity here between people that are being strongly encouraged to use open source versus like, and then they're not encouraged in the same way to contribute back to open source, right?
Well, specifically, the question asked about non-IP policies on non-work contributions. So it might be that people don't know what their IP policies specifically is. It may not mean that they're not allowed to do it or not encouraged to do it, but like that specific policy they're not super familiar with, or that there's something about non-work contributions that are different. We actually didn't ask about contributions on the job, which we should have. That was an oversight, and next year we'll ask about it.
So does that mean they're on work time, they're contributing to non-work open source, and they're not sure about their ability to contribute to non-work open source while working?
It could even be off work though, because people have employment agreements that say that everything that they produce is owned by the company,
whether they're working or not, or even the hardware they're using.
Mm-hmm.
To do
I think
so.
it's really,
yeah.
I mean, it's really telling, right? It's not surprising that everyone's using it, but it's unclear how you're able to contribute back, and hopefully that will change.
So should that just mean that employers should make it a bit more clear about the company's relationship with open source and the permissions around it?
Well, but to come back to your point, right? You were saying that they should dedicate some amount of time. And I don't think that we're at even the place where we can say that they should be dedicating some amount of time, because what this looks like is that employers are encouraging people to use open source and depend on open source at a rate that they are not telling them to contribute back anything.
Yeah, that's certainly true.
And so like just getting those level might be enough, like without, dedicating 4 hours or whatever, right? Like maybe we should be setting our goals a little bit differently.
I mean, they definitely go hand in hand. If you don't have the policy and you don't know what it is, then you're definitely not going to just contribute before you know what the policy is.
Yeah, if you don't know the policy, or if there is one, you're not being encouraged to do so.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like people are anyway and I think that's kind of telling too, because they're it looks like they're doing it because there's no other way, right? Like there's no other way for them to get this bug fixed in their critical dependency unless they have this policy. So they just kind of ignore it. I did notice that there was a restrictive, like people that actually are restricted from contributing and using. And that's the most offensive to me, even though it's a really small number, because it looks like I can't eyeball the numbers from the graph, but it's either 2 or 3 times as many people that are so people, that means that there's like, a bunch of people that are being highly restricted from contributing to open source, but are not being restricted from using it in any way, which is just offensive.
Yeah.
The last one though is a bit telling around the last insight, at least. Open source is the default. I mean, did you really need to do the survey to find that out though?
But you know what I thought
was fun to back up your claims with data though.
Right. Of course, we need that.
What I thought was really interesting about this is it wasn't that people necessarily thought open source was better among most parameters besides security. Like people actually think proprietary does better in a lot of situations, and yet vast majority of people will still seek out open source options, which says something a little bit more interesting to me. Of it's not just like, oh, people recognize that open source is better than proprietary and that's why they do it. It's like they don't even know if it's better or not, but for some reason they're just going to keep using it anyway because it's so like culturally default at this point that like that's just what you do, that it doesn't even matter what the quality is. And that kind of says something too about the state of where we're at with open source. Like everyone is going to use it, but
it's also free though. I mean,
but interestingly, people didn't value the cost that as much as it wasn't even. Cost was not even one of the top reasons why people, what people value in choosing software, which is also really bizarre to me because you would think that those two things would be explicitly tied. I think it goes even this is just me guessing, but like, I think it goes even beyond that of like, people just do open source because they hear that's what they're supposed to be doing. Like people aren't really thinking twice about even that it is open source. They're just like, this is, or the cost or anything. It's just like, this is what I do. I take this software. It comes from magical berries somewhere, and then I just put it in my software, and that's it.
They heard React was cool, and so they used it.
Right, exactly. Like, and that matches up at least with anecdotally how I understand a lot of software gets made.
Yeah, with stability, security, and user experience are the highest of the importance graph. Yet 72% say they always seek it out, and that kind of says to some degree, regardless of stability, security, and user experience, because, as you said, it's the cultural default.
And you can see cost is kind of like down there in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't answer this survey. I wasn't one of the lucky ones who clicked 5 times and went through the special portal. So I didn't get to answer this, but to me, I pay for things, right? I pay for things if I value them, I pay for them. I care how much it costs, but cost matters. But like I'm not seeking it for free. It's like if it matters, you pay for it one way or another, whether it's involvement or actual dollar exchange.
Yeah, it probably matters, like, kind of where in someone's life cycle they are. Like, I bet if we, like, made this plot and split it out by whether people were students versus employed,
that's true.
Like, maybe cost would be
that's
higher.
True. Even if I didn't have the money to pay for it and I still valued it, I'm like, well, I can't buy it, so I'm a student.
Yeah, I haven't looked at that. Someone should look at that. I bet it's interesting. So something like 20% of the data is people who are students.
Well, that's a good point right there, I think, is that someone should look into this. Is like this. So this data that you've pulled back is all open source. The GitHub repo is linked up on the website opensourcesurvey.org. So it's not like you can't go and find it. You can download the data and just get started. There's a big download button at the bottom of the site. So this, what we've been talking through is your findings of this. Like this is your insights from this. So that doesn't mean that somebody else might go and that doesn't mean the questions changed, but someone can go back to this data and kind of pull back more insights than the 5 you've shared here. You've dug into quite a bit. shared a lot of details, even came up with some graphs to kind of share all the data points that we've talked through.
Yeah, the whole point is that it's an open data project, so we hope people will use it and learn from it. There's a lot more in here than we've covered. A lot of really fascinating things that we found but didn't have room for in the write-up. And so please do go analyze it and tell us what you found. We really want to know how people are using it, because we'd like to do this again. We want to know like what was useful, what didn't turn out to be useful, how are people using it.
Can we expect like maybe this to be a once a year thing, twice a year thing? I mean, open source moves fast, so everybody's just trying to keep up. So should we do this once a year, twice a year? What do you see the future of this survey becoming?
So it was a ton of work. I've been sort of thinking like once every 2 years, but if we
I
get
was being
like
ambitious, sorry.
if we get if a lot of people are using it and a lot of people are finding either the insights or the raw data really valuable, and people have ideas about things they want to know over time or new questions they want to ask. I think now that we've done it once, like I have a pretty good idea of like how we could change how we did it so that it would take less time.
Well, the insights part seems to be the most time consuming. Actually conducting or allowing somebody to take the survey seems to be a pretty passive type of role.
Actually, the hardest part was writing the survey. Because I didn't have, I wasn't familiar with kind of the existing research on open source. So I had to go learn about it, and I had to go write a whole 54 question instrument with a lot of help from our collaborators in academia and industry. I don't know if we've talked about them yet, but tons of contributions from people who are doing a lot of active research in this field. But that was actually I think the most time consuming part of it.
Well, now that without having done all the work you've done, of course, I can have this point of view. But now that it's there, do you see the questions needing to change very much to continue the survey? Does it have to stop, or is this something that just sort of can kind of keep operating on the random selections, as you mentioned to Michael's question a bit earlier? Can the same 54 question survey keep going to kind of keep gathering and kind of keep maybe a real-time pulse on the results?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So one of the things we've tried to be conscious of is that open source is a community that's over-surveyed. And so we don't want to add to the noise, right? Like people in open source are constantly getting emails asking them to take surveys. And I mean, partly we hope that we can cut down on some of that uncoordinated research efforts by providing one single high quality data set that everybody uses instead of trying to piece together their own. We don't want to bother people with research unless we think that these things are actually changing over time. But if there is, if people want to know, we saw this last year, we want to know how it's changed a year later because we've invested a lot in, say, our documentation efforts. That's certainly something that we could consider doing. I was sort of thinking that we would do a whole new, every time we do this, we just ask completely different questions to try to open up new avenues of research. But it kind of matters what the research community and what the open source community wants out of this data.
And obviously open source is, hopefully in 2 years from now, there are going to be so many different things that open source will be facing given the pace that it changes at.
Yeah.
So before Adam closes out the changelog here, I'm just going to do a complete takeover for RFC.
Please do. Please do.
Not yet. So RFC, we focus on open source sustainability. And I'm staring at this figure about what open source users value in the software. So why are people actually using open source? And so we know that there's just these widespread sustainability issues. And the first things that they impact, and the things they impact the worst, are stability and security, which are the most important things to people. And conversely, the classic business models around funding open source rely on support or new features. And support is ranked the absolute lowest thing that people care about, with innovation being second to that. So it's just literally the things that people care about and how we've traditionally looked at funding are at opposite ends of the spectrum.
I was hoping someone else would notice that. I'm glad you pointed that out. I think it's funny because like almost always when people talk about turning an open source project into a quote unquote real business or whatever, it's like, oh, we'll just offer support and services. And it's like, actually, people don't really care.
Well, that should be a clear indicator to anybody who's going that route to say that's probably or could be the wrong route to go.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it'd be nice to do this in a year and see if that number changes much, though, because I'm very surprised that those two are the lowest.
We'll see if support gets lower.
I mean, I don't know if it could get any lower. It's like it's literally right above less important. So it's
well, that scale that's not the full scale. I think one thing to keep in mind is that we know these things actually do vary quite a bit by community. So actually this particular set of questions was taken from some ongoing research by a lab over at Carnegie Mellon that studies differences in the values of different ecosystems. And so they've done this among a number of communities and found differences in what different open source communities value in the things that they build and in their own processes. And so, this is sort of overall, if you aggregate all of the projects together, this is what falls out of that. But there's probably significant variation between communities in what they value. So for your individual project, it may not be the case that support is the least important thing, but when you aggregate everyone together, that's how it falls out.
Any call to action for those listening? So we got lots of people who listen to this show, a lot of people who care about open source. Either they're contributors, they desire to get into new languages, they listen to the show for various reasons, at all chasms of developerhood, so to speak. What any core call to action could you give? I mean, obviously, go check it out, pull down the data, play with it if you're a data scientist or anybody to sort of gather your own insights. But what other call to actions can you give to the listening audience?
I really hope that open source projects use some of this stuff to figure out how to get new contributors on board and how to strengthen their communities, because I think there's a lot of really good insights around that.
So opensourcesurvey.org. And I'll also mention that at the very bottom, you can subscribe to survey updates. So you can put your email address in there, click the button subscribe. And I guess that means that we'll obviously have to do another show like this because this was super fun. I mean, I love just kind of roundtabling this, kind of digging through everything and getting to hear different perspectives. It's been a lot of fun. So Nadia, Mikeal, Frannie, this has been fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Changelog is produced by myself, Adam Stacoviak, and also Jared Santo. We are edited by Jonathan Youngblood, and our theme music is produced by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. You can find more episodes like this at changelog.com or by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to our sponsors, Sentry, TopTal, GoCD, and also Microsoft with their Azure Open Dev Conference. Check that out. Also, thanks to Fastly, our bandwidth partner. Head to fastly.com to learn more. And also Linode, our cloud server of choice. Head to linode.com/changelog, and we'll see you next week.